We are in Genesis chapter 12. And we've been studying Genesis so far, and so far, Genesis has been about major events. Last week, you may remember, there's a bunch of people, but it's been major events. Like, for example, the creation of the heavens and the earth, creation of the universe. And that was followed by the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, where their story led to sin entering into the world. And then we saw the flood with Noah and the ark, where there was a universal flood. And we talked about how there's evidence of a universal flood on the earth today that we can look at. And that's where God judged a whole generation and the waters flooded the earth. And last week we talked about the fallout of man after the flood. And we talked about the Tower of Babel. That was when the group was trying to not spread out like God told them to, and they were trying to build a tower to heaven, and God confused their languages, and they dispersed from there. But now we get to Genesis 12, and it's like a turning point in the book of Genesis, where we go between to events to now we're talking about like people. We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about specific people. And specifically, we're talking about the formation of the nation through the next couple chapters, and that's the formation of the nation of Israel through Abram. And the next 39 chapters, as a matter of fact, is, like I said, it's going away from events, and we're talking about people. And we're going to see biographies, pretty much, about Abram, beginning with Abram, then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph. That's what we'll be covering the rest of the landscape in the book of Genesis. And those will dominate the landscape. Just to kind of give you an idea how important this is to God, the first 11 chapters that we've already covered, it covers about 2,000 plus years of history, where the next 39 chapters are only 350 years of history. So he spends a lot of time in those 350 years in talking about these specific people and the biographies of these people. And in the next 16 chapters in the middle of Genesis is all about this one man, this Abram, who we're going to begin to talk about today. And we're going to look at his story, his testimony. And today we're going to look at two things. We're going to see his testimony and his testing. That's what these next 20 verses in chapter 12 is all about. And you probably already know this, but Abram, when you think about world religions, there's three major world religions that will trace their lineage or trace their spiritual heritage, if you will, back to Abraham, at least in part. They pay reverence to him. And that would be the Jewish nation, that would be Christians, and that would also be the Muslims. And they don't really have a lot of things that they agree with, but one thing they do agree with is Abram. And we'll see why in these blessings that God tells Abram as we continue on. And all of them look to Abraham and revere him. However, if you've ever read the Quran and the writings of the Quran about Abraham, the story is written a little bit differently. When it comes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where Isaac is the one where he takes up and almost sacrifices to God. Well, if you read the Quran, they take out Isaac and they put Ishmael in there in Genesis 22 as the one that Abraham almost sacrifices to God. So they rewrite the story, but nonetheless, these three religions, they look at Abram as a blessing and as something that they think of in their history. So you have this bulk of material that focuses on this one man, Abraham. And that influence is not only in the Old Testament, but it also carries into the New Testament. We see in the New Testament, the book of Galatians, it has this talking about that Abram's a man of faith. He's an example of faith. And in Romans, it uses Abraham as actually the prime example as the justification of faith. Abraham's believed God, and it was accounted into him as righteousness. So he becomes this example of what it means to be justified by trusting in God apart from our own works. And in the New Testament, Paul actually talks about how that Abraham came before the law. When Moses came, Abraham came before that. And therefore, that faith is a predominant over the law. Not only that, but the writer of Hebrews, if you go to Hebrews chapter 11, Abram is in what we call the hall of faith. It's a list of all these people who are faithful to God, and Abram's one of those guys in there. And 3 times, like I said this last week, but 3 times the Bible says that Abram is a friend of God. Once in 2 Chronicles 20, once in Isaiah 41, and once in James 2. It all calls him a friend of God. And to this day, there are people groups that still would say Abraham is a friend of God. So let's dive in. This is Genesis 1, chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your house, father's house, to the land that I will show you.'" So what we have to understand about Abram is his story actually begins in chapter 11. In chapter 11, we said that he was from this place called Ur of the Chaldeans, and that's where his story begins. It's important for us to kind of understand what this place was about, to kind of give us a idea of what Abram's life was like before God called him out of that land. So this place called Ur was the center of idolatry. There was idol worshiping there. There was a lot of different gods and goddesses that worshipped in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this, because I want to paint a picture of what this father of faith, this Abraham, what his life was like in Ur, what it was like before God called him out. There was a lot of different gods of nature there. And one of the principal gods, this is interesting, one of the principal gods was the moon god. And ironically, this moon god was called Sin. I thought that was fitting for a false god. This moon god was called Sin, this moon god. So Abram would essentially been a Mooney, if you will. And so would his family. He'd be these Moonies, and so they worshipped these false idols. And we actually get more information about Abram's home life in chapter 24 of Joshua. Joshua tells us about Abram's background. So in Joshua 24, it says, "Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel, for their heads, their judges, and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, 'Thus says the Lord God of Israel.'" So this is God speaking through Joshua to the Israelites here. He says, "Your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods." So he's talking about him in Ur of the Chaldeans. "And then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river," and this river, just in case you're wondering, is the Euphrates River, "and he led him through the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac." So we see a little bit of his home life here. It kind of comes out for us, and as Joshua explains it. And so my point is, he was raised in an atmosphere of idol worshiping. So no doubt there was this worshiping of the moon god and other gods in his household, and those things would have shaped his life. So Abram wasn't a worshiper of Yahweh until God appeared to him, drew him out of this place called Ur, and out of the culture, and brought him into a new land. And I think about this, and I think about my own life, and I apply this to my own life. And I know that God desires to pull us out of a toxic environment, an environment that is not good for us. That, for Abram, it was an idol-worshiping country. It was idol-worshiping. For me, it was a place of drugs and addiction. But he wants to pull us out of that and put us into a new place where we can grow in Christ and grow in our faith. And he desires that for each one of us. And a good place to start, you may think, well, I don't know where to go. I don't like the way I'm living over here, but I don't know where to go. A good place to start is, well, you're here. You're at church. Another place is at Life Group. You can come to Life Group, and people will pour into you, and you may not believe this, but you'll be able to pour into other people as well as Celebrate Recovery. There's places that you can go. But God desires to do that. He desires to pull us out of our darkness into his marvelous light, as it says in 1 Peter. So All that to say is to show you what it was like for him in Ur of the Chaldeans. Another thing that we want to talk about that came from chapter 11, it comes in verse 28, that Abram suffered a loss. He had a tragedy in his life. In verse 28, it says, and Haran, and so Haran is Abraham's brother, essentially. And it says he died before his father Terah in the native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. So there was a tragedy. He lost his brother, and it had to have impacted Abram's life. I don't know if you've ever lost, maybe you've lost a brother or sister or something really close to you, but that has an impact on your life. You probably remember when you heard the news that this person died. And you probably, when you think about that, even those emotions may come storming back into your life when you think about it. So I would say that it had a big impact on Abram's life. And we need to keep that in mind as we talk about Abram, that there was loss. So this tragedy and there's loss that shaped the early life of Abram. And I'd say you have to keep that in mind because he ended up taking his brother's son, Lot, and basically took him under his wing and had to take care of him. So that's why it's something to remember. And Lot, we'll see in the coming chapters, is going to be a part of the story. And we'll talk about Lot as we continue through Genesis as well. Another thing that we want to take note of from the last chapter, in chapter 11, is verse 30. Because the God makes big note of this and does big things through this. In verse 30 of chapter 11, it says, but Sarai, that's Abraham's wife, was barren. She had no children. So let me just paint this big picture for you. So you have this guy who comes from an idol-worshiping country, who has some tragedy where his brother died, and his wife that he married, who he expected to have children. After all, Abram means father, that they couldn't have children. They were barren. And this all shaped his life, and it sets us up for the rest of the story because, as you know, if you know the story of Abram, God blesses Abraham miraculously with his son Isaac, and the son of promise in a miraculous way. But at this point, Sarah is barren. She's not able to bear children. So I imagine that after they got married, they were expecting to be able to have children, and they weren't able to. She was never able to get pregnant. And I'm saying all this because I want to paint a picture of who he was and where he was coming from. You know, I was washing the dishes, and I was washing the dishes, and my daughter has, what's it called? A smoothie. Thank you. A smoothie in the morning. And when she gets done with the smoothie, I'll put it in the sink, and I'll turn on the water. And so that the smoothie residue is on the cup. And as I turn on the water, all that residue starts coming up, and it starts cleaning up the cup without me even really washing it very much. And I was thinking about this, and God just like put this image in my mind. But if I let that cup just sit there, and I didn't let the water run through it, then say I let it sit there for a couple of days, and it got hard, and I ran that water through it, it wouldn't break it up as much as it would before. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe if you're like our family, some dishes end up laying around longer than others. But I'm trying to paint this picture because that is our life. And Abraham's life had all this baggage, all this stuff that was stuck to him, and God was trying to pour into his life, and this stuff was stuck. It wouldn't come out. And God had to keep working on Abraham. And that is an imagery of our lives as well, that he has to continue to work on our lives because some things are stuck in our lives. Some things we can't get rid of right away. The water just can't come and it takes it right away. That God has to continue to let us trust him and let us trust him until he does take those things away. But if you look at Acts 7, I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen, but Stephen is considered the first martyr for Jesus Christ. And Stephen, right before he's stoned and he's martyred, he's talking to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and he gives us a little history lesson, and he talks about Abram. He says this about in Acts 7, verse 2. He says, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory that's a very unique name used for God only here. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. And he said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to the land that I will show you. So this is in Ur, right? This is not in where he's heading now, in Haran. And then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and he dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father died, he, that is the Lord, moved him to the land in which you now dwell. So let's piece this all together. So what has happened? God miraculously appeared to Abram when he was in Ur of the Chaldeans and where he was raised. And this is what God said. He said, I want you to do three things. I want you to leave home. I want you to leave your family, leave your relatives, and I want you to go to the land that I will show you. Those three things, which is the land of Canaan. And now he did the first thing. He left Ur, but he didn't do the second. He didn't leave his relatives. They went with him, or should I say that he went with them, because in chapter 11, it actually represents as Terah doing the leading, his father doing the leading. And they did not go to the land that God called them, which is the land of Canaan. They stopped in Haran. And they lived there for at least 15 years until the old man died. And then he went to the promised land, the land of Canaan. Now we can say this about Abram. He had a rough life. He grew up in an idol worshiping country. He had tragedy in his life. His wife isn't barren. We can say all these things. His life was tough and he had bad circumstances, but he didn't obey God. He didn't go all the way to the land that God told him to go, which was Canaan. He brings his father, he brings Lot, and Lot will actually prove to be a problem as we continue through the book of Genesis. And his dad proves to be a delay in finding the will of God. So, saying all this, what's the application for us today? The application is this, is your past, the circumstances that you were raised in, the things that you were brought up in, the things that you are defined by, maybe your heritage, your past, your culture, your upbringing, your family, perhaps a lack of love, that can either be a hitching post or a guidepost. Now, a hitching post is say, okay, I'm hitching it right here. This is where I'm staying. This is where we are. I'm not leaving here. Where a guidepost is saying, okay, this is the direction I'm going to go. So we can let our past, it can hold us back, or we can learn from it. We can be shaped by it. And through Christ, we can be redeemed of it. So it can be a hitching post or a guidepost. And it seems that whatever we bring into this new life, when we give our lives to Christ, whatever we bring with us into that new life ends up being a problem. It becomes a delay. And I don't know if you remember, last week we talked about what the meaning of Haran means. And the meaning of Haran means delayed. So literally, Abram and Terah and all their family went, hey, let's go to this place called Delayed. Let's go to Delayed. And they were in Haran for 15 years. They didn't do what God promised them to. And that's what they did. But what I want to point out here is two things. Number one, Abraham's faith wasn't up here. You know, we read about him being the father of faith, and he's in the hall of faith. But his faith wasn't up here. His faith is down here, and God has to build that faith. And he has to trust God. And as he trusts God, he's building upon that faith. And the second thing is that Abraham's partial obedience here doesn't take away God's promise. God promised him this. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about unconditional covenants, and this was that unconditional covenant. Instead, it meant the promise was in delay. And it's interesting because they were in delay figuratively, and they were in delay physically. Actually, they were actually called, go to this place called delay. And he was in delay until he did what God told him to do. Abraham would certainly become this giant of faith in what Galatians says, the father of believers. Yet he didn't start there. We see Abram be an example of growing in faith and growing in obedience. And I hope that is encouraging to each one of us here. Because a lot of times we think, oh man, I don't have enough faith. But look at Abram. God grew his faith, and he can do exactly the same thing in each one of us as we put our trust in him. So let's keep going. In verses 2 and 3, we see the promises repeated. It says, in verse 2, it says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So here we see the promises of God. And I want us to notice how many times God says, I will, in these verses. See, Genesis chapter 11 was all about the plans of man, and Genesis 12 is all about the plans of God. You know, so often we make our Christianity all about what we can do for God. Like, what have you done for God? What have you done for Jesus? But the truth is, we can't do anything apart from God. We can't do anything until we realize what God has done for us. One of my favorite verses is 1 John 4:19. It says, we love because he first loved us. See, God made the first move. And when we realize that, and only when we realize that, can anything by his grace and through his Spirit ever be done for the case of Christ, for the cause of Christ. You know, I haven't really done anything for Christ, but Christ can do things in me and through me and for me. And it reminds me of John F. Kennedy, is one of the former presidents in the United States. And he had this famous speech, and he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I think a lot of people make that their relationship with God. They ask not what God can do for you, but what you can do for God. And I love the fact that here, that God is saying to Abraham, I understand you're from this pagan, you're a pagan idolater, you have this tragedy that's happened in your family with your brother dying, and you can't have children, so I will. I love that. And let me tell you, if you can believe the I wills from God, then God's going to do miraculous things in you like he does in Abram. Because these I wills from God that are for us, and it's through Jesus, is he says, if you will put your faith in Jesus Christ and you give your life to him, then you will be saved. That's a unconditional I will for us. And essentially, that's Abram's story. Sorry if I keep saying Abraham and Abram, because it's essentially the same person, and God changes his name to Abram. So if you hear me say Abraham, just know that it's the same guy. But he does that in Abraham's life. He has no ability to bear children. His wife isn't able to bear children, but he still makes a great nation. And that's exactly what he promises them in verse 2. It says, I will make you a great nation. See, God promised to make a nation from Abram. And he will have enough children and grandchildren to further descendants to populate a nation, the nation of Israel. And God also promised him in verse 2, God promised to bless Abram and to make his name great. We've already mentioned that there's 3 religions that revere his name. His name is indeed great. The Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians all honor Abram. But here's another I will from God in verse 3. It says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So let's take that first one. I will bless those who bless you. You know, some people will look at Israel today and will say Israel needs the United States of America as an ally, and they really need international support. And I did some research, and the United States was actually one of the first modern nations to grant full citizenship and protection to the Jewish people. And I believe that this is one of the reasons why the United States is so blessed. I think the fact is that the truth is the United States needs Israel. I will bless those who bless you. But the second part of that says, I will curse those who curse you. Now, if you look at ancient history, we see that in the Bible. We see where ancient history, whether it's the Babylonians, the Syrians, the Romans, the Egyptians in Egypt, they became second-rate nations. But if you also look at modern history, modern times, Spain, England. At one time, England and the British Empire, they ruled the world. They ruled the seas. But Britain lost her empire when she broke her faith with Israel. And Poland fell after harming the Jewish nation. And we all know what happened to Nazis in Hitler's Germany. So you just follow the nations, ancient and modern, and that have turned against Israel, and you see that this is true. You see that what has become of them It says, I will curse those who curse you. Another promise in verse 3 is this. It says, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, all the families of the earth, that's my family, that's your family. That's what we have to understand. That's all the families of the earth. Not only was Abraham's promised blessing, but God also promised him to make him a blessing, even to the point where all the families on the earth was going to be blessed in Abraham. And we read about this in Galatians 3, 8 and 9. It says, in the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. And by the way, the Gentiles is anyone that's not a Jewish. So I'm a Gentile, and if you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile. And it says, preaching the gospel to Abraham beforehand. So he's preaching the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you, all the nations shall be blessed. Exactly what we're reading in Genesis 12. So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham. And then in Revelation 5:9, the last book of the Bible, it says, and they sang a new song, saying, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seal. For you were slain, and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe, get this, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation. So here's the point. The focus here is Jesus. Everything before the cross points to the cross. Everything after the cross points back to the cross. It's all focusing on Jesus. It's pointing to Jesus. The work of Jesus will touch every people group of the earth. That's what it says in Revelations. That's what he's promising to Abraham right here in Genesis 12. Let's go on, verse 4. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So once again, we see that Abram's actually being disobedient to the Lord, because the Lord told him to leave his family behind. Yet he brings Lot with him. He brings his nephew. And Lot wouldn't be a blessing for Abram. As we continue through Genesis, you'll see what I mean. But he would be nothing but trouble and inconvenience, as we'll see as we continue through the book of Genesis. So let's keep going. This is 5 through 9. It says, then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they parted to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree and Morah, and the Canaanites were in that land. So we see Abraham is arriving in Canaan, where God's telling him to go. And there God appears to him, and starting at verse 7. It says, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west of Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. So once Abraham went to the land, God reminded him of his promise. That the land Abraham saw that he was looking at belonged to Abraham and his descendants. He says, to your descendants, I will give you this land. But it's interesting that Abram never actually owned any land except for a burial plot. And yet, this promise to him was enough for him to claim the whole land, and indeed the whole country. And we also see after God appears to him, what does he do? He says he's built an altar to the Lord. So Abraham thought this was an important thing to do. The altar was important to Abraham. Why? Well, because it was a place where he could meet with God. It was a place to make sacrifices for sins. It was a place to show submission to God and to worship God. And us Christians, we also have an altar. In Hebrews 13:10, it speaks of this. It says, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. And we meet with God at our own place where we remember the sacrifice that Jesus Christ did on the cross. At the end of today's message, we're going to take communion and we're going to remember what Jesus did on the cross together. And this altar is where we submit to God as what Romans calls a living sacrifice, and where we offer a sacrifice of praise up to the Lord for what he did on the cross. But also notice what Abraham does. It says he pitched a tent. So even in the land that God gave him, Abraham never lived in a house. It was always a tent. And tents are homes for those who are just passing by, right? But they don't put down permanent roots, right? And we talked about, another place we talked about a tent was in 1 Peter, with Peter talks about a tent. And he says, we too are to live like tent dwellers, as pilgrims on the earth. So we should live as people who have their permanent dwelling place in heaven, not on earth. See, too many Christians want to build mansions here on earth and are happy or satisfied with tents in heaven. And a pilgrim is someone who leaves home and travels to a specific place. A pilgrim isn't a drifter. A pilgrim has a goal. And Abram's goal and our goal was God's prepared heavenly city. It's heaven. It's not this earth. It's not the things of this earth. Our goal is heaven. We should live our life like it. In Hebrews 11:16, it talks about this heavenly city. It says, but now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And that's what we should be living for. We should be living for our heavenly home and not our earthly home. Let's keep going. Verse 10. And now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, again, I'll remind you that Abraham's faith is down here, not up here. And this is another example of this, because God didn't tell him to go to Egypt. God said, go to where I told you, go to Canaan. But he goes to Egypt. And, honestly, I can't wrong him for that. I mean, he's worried about the famine and he's worried about his family. So I can understand that. But Abraham was wrong in thinking God would not provide for him in the land that he told him to go. After all, God called Abraham to Canaan and not Egypt. And I think Abram, like most of us, find it easier to trust God in the far off things than our needs that are right in front of us right now. So Abram went down to Egypt, and when we are tested in the same way, in similar ways, we often believe our actions are all right because there's no harm. There's no harm to come from this. I can do this. There's no harm that's coming from this. Though God blessed and protected Abraham while he was in Egypt, there was in fact harm that did come from it. There was excess baggage, if you will, that came with Abraham. And also a rebuke from a king. A pagan king had to rebuke him, so harm did in fact come. And it especially showed up later when the slave girl named Hagar, who Sarai acquires in Egypt, is a source of great trouble for Abram's family. And we'll read about that as we continue through the book of Genesis. So let's read what happens in verses 11 through 13. And it came to pass that when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Now, keep in mind that she is 60 years old at this point. She's 60 years old. And he says in verse 12, therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me. But they will let you live. And in verse 13, please say that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So essentially, he's trying to get his wife to lie for him. Again, Abram's faith down here, not here, right? He's not trusting God for protection. He's trying to do it himself. And how many times have I, or maybe you've experienced this too, have saying, all right, God, I know this plan you have for me, but I'm going to try to force it. I'm going to try to make it, do it myself. And then fatigue comes in, and we get tired, and we get worn out, and we just say, all right, God, this is yours. And then God grows our faith ever so little bit, little pieces at a time. That's what we see. But he says to his wife, please say that you are my sister. Now, this is a half-truth because she was his half-sister. But what I always tell people at Celebrate Recovery, a half-truth is, in fact, a whole lie. See, Abraham's intent was clear. He was trying to deceive them because he thought he needed to protect himself instead of trusting God to protect them. And the thing is, for each one of us here today, if we want to do something wrong, then we're going to find any excuse to do it. And if we don't have an excuse to do it, let me rest assured that the enemy is going to give you some ideas and suggest some things. See, ideally, Abraham would have said, you know what? God promised me a great nation, and that hasn't happened yet, so I'm indestructible. I can't be harmed because this hasn't come through, and God's promises are always true. He could have done that. His faith could have been up here, but it wasn't. We see that his faith was down here. You hear me repeat that over and over again because it's important for us to understand, because a lot of times our faith is down here. But something else worth mentioning here is in Genesis 26, when Isaac is in the picture, Isaac does the exact same thing that we see Abram doing here. He tries to tell Rebekah to lie about her being his wife and saying that she's his sister. The same thing. The father did it, and now in chapter 26, the son does it. And the Bible doesn't teach that we're bound by generational curses. So don't hear me say that. But it's often the case that the sin of the father is found in their children. That's because those sins of the flesh have been nurtured in that environment. So this shows us that we need to be careful of the environment that we're allowing our children to be nourished in. Because they see us. Yeah, I don't know if you ever heard the monkey see, monkey do. Well, children see, children do. I've seen that in my own life. And when you have kids, or if you ever had kids, you probably know what I mean. It's important that we raise them in an environment where it's a good nurturing. So let's see what God does with this. In verses 14 and 15. And so it was when Abram came to Egypt and the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commanded her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Now this is a huge deal. This may seem like this little event happened, but this is a serious deal because of what God's redemption plan was going to be through these two. That God was going to promise them a generation. So Sarai's womb cannot be defiled by some pagan king. It would have been a tragedy if that happened. So God had to intervene, and we see what happens when he intervenes. In verse 16 through 20, it says, he treated Abraham well for her sake, and had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord, this is what the Lord does, verse 17. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called Abraham and said, what is this that you've done to me? Why did you tell me that she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her for my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So even though Abram sinned and lied, we see God still blessed Abraham even though he didn't do what he should have done. God continued to protect him even though he acted like a liar. God did not call back his promise to Abraham because the promise depended on God. It didn't depend on Abraham. And that is God's character. His love is based on him. It's not based on what we do. It's based on who he is. Another favorite verse of mine is Romans 5:8. That God demonstrates his own love in this, that though we are sinners, Christ died for us. And we see that Abraham, he lied here, yet though this love of God doesn't leave Abraham because of his faith in God, even though it has a little faith. And we see that Abram says, or the king says, what is this that you've done to me? So sadly, this pagan king had to rebuke Abram. And it that also shows that if Abram would have just told the truth, that everything would have been okay. It would have been all right. And in verse 20, it ends the chapter. It says, so Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So what does this show us? What does this encounter with Pharaoh show us? It shows us if your doubt leads to disobedience, then you are dangerous. And we see Abram is in fact dangerous to Pharaoh. Now God said that you're going to be a blessing to all people. But to Pharaoh, my tray keeps going down. To Pharaoh, he's a curse. He's a curse to Pharaoh. And what a great lesson for us. See, what happens is that Abram lost his testimony. He lost his integrity. I mean, he'll get it back in next chapter as we continue, as God continues to grow his faith. But it does just sort of leave us with a reminder that we're being watched, that we're being listened to. Our life, how we live our life, it's not just the words we speak, but the way we do and the things we say, people see, and it is a testimony of who we are. And that testimony can be a bad thing, or it can be a good thing. It can be rich, or it can be poor. And we all have a testimony. Abraham's whole life, faith testimony is spoiled in this moment. And at the same time, I'm encouraged, like I've said over and over again, and I hope you're encouraged by this, that the father of faith, Abraham, wasn't perfect. He wasn't a perfect man. But God is in the business of growing Abraham into this great man of faith. And that requires circumstances where Abraham had to trust God. You know, I love this quote from a commentator that I read, and I want to read it to you. It says, faith is not a mushroom that grows overnight in a damp soil. It is an oak tree that grows for thousands of years under the blast of the wind and rain. So it's talking about our faith. It's a growing. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's us trusting God and obeying God, and then our faith growing in that. And it's through opportunities for us to trust God, through trials and through us persevering through that. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what Romans 5, 1 through 5 says, and that's how I'll end our talk today. It says, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace of which we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. So we give our lives to Jesus Christ, and we're justified by this faith, and we stand in this grace that he gives us, and we can hope in this glory. But in verse 3, it goes on. It says, and not only that, so there's more. He says, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulations produce perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who is given to us. So we see that this is the golden chain of Christian growth and maturity. One virtue built on another virtue as we grow in the patterns of Jesus. And as we put our faith in Jesus, as we trust in Jesus, as we persevere, our character grows, our hope grows. And that's how God grows us in our relationship with him and in our faith in him. And rest assured, just as God is doing this in Abraham, as we're going to continue to see through the book of Genesis, that he will in fact do this with each one of us sitting in here today. There's never a point where we arrive, where we say, I have all the faith that I need now. No, God is going to continue to grow us in our faith through every circumstance as we persevere. He builds character and grows our hope in him.